Kevin's going to talk to us this morning about de-oiled distillers grains. Without further delay, Kevin, carry on.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. As Kim mentioned, I'm Kevin Herrick. I'm the Technical Services Director with Poet Nutrition, and I also have Isaac Crawford in the room with me. Isaac is the Vice President of Merchandising for Poet. So we thank you for participating, and just to give you a little bit of background on, if I can advance my slides here, just kind of what we're going to address in our short presentation this morning. Give a little introduction about Poet and kind of our background, and a little overview of also the ethanol process, and in particular some of the things that how Poet differentiates from other competitors. Talk a little bit about quite a bit about reduced fat DDGs, look at the advantages as well as the disadvantages and kind of where they fit into the different markets. And then I'll also look at the kind of the research and the formulation from a diets for the different species as well. The Poet network is comprised of 28 ethanol plants, and most of those plants are located in the upper Midwest and a little bit on the Eastern Corn Belt. Those 28 plants, we produce over 550 million pounds of corn oil per year and over 9 billion pounds of distillery grains annually. So we're one of the two largest producers of ethanol in the United States and the world, and feed a lot of animals with the DDGs and the corn oil. So one of the concerns that or perceptions of the ethanol industry is that it uses so much corn for the ethanol, but really, if we think about it, only about a third of the corn kernel actually goes to ethanol, and we actually utilize a third of it for DDGs or for distillers grains. So if we do all those calculations, the ethanol industry reduces the feed. The net effect is really about 17.5% of the corn crop, and oftentimes you'll see numbers close to 40. But since we are able to utilize that high quality co-product from the ethanol process as a feed, we actually are giving a nice benefit to the animal. A little bit about the ethanol process, and really this kind of fits for all ethanol process. So it's the whole premise is the same. We want to extract utilize the starch from that corn kernel and to make ethanol. So it starts out with the corn, and it's ground. It's mixed with enzymes, yeast, to break down that starch and those glucose, and actually go through the fermentation. So once we use those yeast, and it ferments for several days, it goes then through the distillation system where we're actually able to extract the ethanol, and the ethanol is collected. Once it goes through the distillation system, we end up with the whole stillage, and that goes through the centrifuge where we kind of separate the solids from the liquids again. And then this is where it kind of comes into a situation with the reduced oil. So once that thin stillage actually goes through another centrifuge, and we can actually extract more of the corn oil. And in Poet's system, that corn oil is marketed as voila. Once that defatted syrup with the oil removed, it goes back, and then it combines again with the wet grain, and once it goes through the dryer, that's when we come up with dry distillers grains with solubles. For the Poet system, that DDGs is actually separated, so the DDGs that meet our specs as far as fat and protein, as well as a couple other criteria, is considered Dakota Gold, and any DDGs that isn't goes into a different, or is segregated. So after that whole process, what remains with the DDGs that Poet produces? Typically, the reduced oil contains a little bit greater crude protein, and a lot of that is because of the dilution effect. We're taking out a little bit more of the oil, so that just bumps up the crude protein a little bit. If we look at it on an as-fed basis, we're running about 27 to 29% crude protein. And then once again, less fat. So if we can get down to that 4.5 to 5.5% fat. There's a lot of terminology in the industry, and you'll hear reduced fat, de-oil, low fat. We hear terms such as reduced fat, de-oiled, low fat. Typically, it's really close to related, but the same thing. However, with different systems or different plants, can really extract different amounts. So reduced fat would really refer to anything that's 5 to 9% fat. De-oiled is around that 3 to 5% fat. The question is asked, why is oil extracted? What's the big benefit of the oil? Well, the big thing is it's a better market. A lot of the corn oil, distillers corn oil that is extracted either goes to two markets, either the biodiesel market or else into the poultry or the monogastric market, where as a feed additive. So it's if you look at the economics of that, those markets command about 25 cents per pound for the distillers corn oil, compared to if it was contributing volume to the DDGs, it'd only be about that 6 cents per pound. So that's why there's incentive for ethanol plants to really extract as much oil as possible. It does offer a few advantages when we look at the effect on the DDGs. In certain markets, dairy cattle, and we'll get into example a little bit later that it goes in more detail, but we can feed more and not promote milk fat depression. If in the dairy cattle, if we feed too much, especially of an unsaturated fatty acid, there's intermediates in the rumen that are created which really depress milk fat. And if we can eliminate that, we can actually feed more and have a better economic impact on the ration. Similarly, swine with the unsaturated fat and the belly fat problems. Too much of the unsaturated fat and we get really soft fats. So if we can avoid that and actually have a little bit more or less fat, we can feed more DDGs and still have a good quality fat. Other advantages, we've investigated some things with pelleting. If you notice the images on the right, the one on the image on the left, a smaller image is actually a low fat or a reduced fat DDG that we pelleted, and on the right is a higher fat. So we were able to get a much longer pellet, a much harder pellet, and that's kind of typical with the reduced fat DDGs. Other advantages, oxidation, once again related to a little bit less fat, and we don't have as many concerns about going rancid and things like that. Improved fiber digestibility has been investigated, some carcass characteristics and feed efficiency, and a lot of those characteristics have been looked at in beef diets. Along with some of the advantages, we also do have some disadvantages. I guess the number one is, well, and this isn't mentioned, or isn't on the slide, but really it's kind of the variability. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of different steps within the ethanol process. A lot of different plants have different protocols, different yeasts, a lot of different steps. So in the end, we end up with the DDGs that has a lot of variability, and it's important to really consider that when looking at it. The other thing is the perception. As soon as we hear the term reduced fat or de-oiled, we automatically think, okay, well, there's a lot less value, a lot less nutritional value in that product, and that's really incorrect. When we look at a lot of has been investigated. The reason for this is that there are other factors that affect energy, and one of them, it really is looking at the fiber fraction, the digestibility. And this was an example from a study from 2013 with Kerr that looked at fat versus gross energy. So all the little dots represent individual DDG samples, and on the x-axis with the fat is the fat content. So if we look at gross energy, which would be the energy that's available once we just put it through a bomb calorimeter, that actually goes exactly with the way we think. More fat, we actually get improved energy or improved gross energy. However, if we look at digestible energy, which is more a measure of what the animal can use, all of a sudden we don't see that relationship. And in fact, there's a very it's almost linear, and it's really a scatter plot or scatter relationship. So the question is why, and if why is there such a difference, especially if we look at the two points, and the slides got a little bit off there, but especially at the 4.5 a 5, very, very similar fat, but why the difference in digestible energy? Well, if we look at the fiber digestibility for that top point, 70.19 for ADF and 57, and the bottom one is 58 and 49. That's one of the big reasons why that there is differences in that energy content. So bottom line is that really we can't just look at the fat to estimate the energy content to the animal. So if we go into a little bit of the different species, why it works. Why DDGs in dairy diets? Number one, it's a good source of nutrients. It has a favorable amino acid profile as far as rumen undegradable and degradable amino acids. It really fits in well. The availability of the product, like as I mentioned, just Poet's production alone, it's widely available, and producers can be confident that they're always going to have a supply of it. So that's another big big advantage. And then finally, the value. The little chart on the right is Feed Val 6, which is was produced by University of Wisconsin, and it estimates the value, the nutritional value of the ingredients compared to the other ingredients. So what really the different components. And just about all the time, Distillers Dried Grains comes out with a better nutritional value compared to the market value. So you're actually getting more bang for your buck for your DDGs. So what about that? As I mentioned, DDGs works well in the dairy rations, but the limitation is the fat. We get too much fat, and we have those excessive that milk fat depression. And because of this, the inclusion amount is limited in rations, and reduced fat DDGs offers opportunities to improve that. So if we look at, this was a field demonstration that was done where we looked at 2 different diets. So the original, and the number to really look at is the as-fed pounds per day. So we're feeding about 4 pounds of DDGs in that original diet. For the test diet, we increased that up to 10 pounds of DDGs. So significant increase. We are able to keep the diet very, very similar as far as crude protein, rumen degradable protein, energy, and then fiber. But the big difference was, or 2 big differences was that we were able to lower that fatty acid, that one unsaturated fatty acid, that's C18-1 trans 10, by 23.56 grams. And then the other big advantage was that we're able to lower the feed cost by 22 cents per head per day. So if we look at the results, milk production is the same between the 2 different rations. Milk fat, just 3.8 to 3.75, so basically the exact same thing. So we didn't have any milk fat depression by feeding that higher amount of DDGs. And bottom line, with the savings in feed costs and also the similar production, we're able to have a total savings of about 34 cents per cow per day. So how about monogastrics? I guess we started out with the ruminant to the dairy because if you take a look at the DDG usage in the United States, the vast majority goes to the ruminants, either the beef or the dairy. About 7.21% of domestic DDGs goes for swine and 5.3% for poultry, which still represents a significant contribution. Even with that amount, the reason why that a lot of the monogastric is a lot of the same reasons. As in ruminants. It's economical, it's widely available, and it does have a very good source of nutrients. In addition, there has been a lot of research done on the monogastric species, not only on poultry, but also on swine as well. These are just a few of the more recent journal articles that have been published. All these are related to poultry, but we've had research looking at carcass characteristics in the poultry, laying hen rations, looking at the protein digestibility and also the egg characteristics. So really, what has all that research discovered? One of the things is that the impact of the reduced fat DDGs on the swine is low. As I mentioned, there are many things that affect metabolizable energy. And as a result, really not all reduced fat DDGs are the same. So once again, if we see a 4.5% fat DDG, it may not be the same as far as the performance to the animal as another 4.5 from a different plant or a different process. The other thing that the research has discovered is that, or demonstrated, is that if we look back several years, the whole process of the ethanol industry has really evolved and is continuing to evolve. So that those DDGs that were produced even 5 years ago or 10 years ago is considerably different than the DDGs that are being produced now. So when we look at the research, we probably have to really interpret that data very carefully and consider, okay, well, how are they extracting the fat, or what other processes did they have in the ethanol which could affect the DDGS quality. A lot of the studies have demonstrated that reduced fat DDGs can be fed similar to conventional DDGs. So whatever the producer was comfortable with feeding on the conventional, we can substitute the DDG, and as long as we get an accurate energy estimate, and as long as that energy estimate is not only based on fat, but on digestible energy or some other measure of energy to the animal, we can feed reduced fat very successfully. There are some issues that probably have to be considered a little bit closer. Some evidence of a little bit poorer amino acid digestibility with reduced fat DDGs, and that has to be taken into account. And then also the impact that the ethanol process and heat could have on the DDGs. POET's overall approach to the DDGs is try to minimize as much heat as possible, and we feel that that has a significant advantage on the quality of the DDGs because it isn't being exposed to as much heat. But that's always something to really be considered, or to carefully monitor. And then also look at the handling characteristics, and you look at DDG, reduced fat can have some advantages. One of the things that we really don't consider, but is could be an important factor in the quality, is the impact of the yeast has on the protein, the final protein of the DDG. Yeast really represent, or the yeast biomass represent, a good source of quality protein. And some estimates have as much as 20% of the DDG protein is from the yeast, and not just from the corn protein. So if we think of from a quality of the protein standpoint, it's maybe not just the same as corn. Finally, one of the emerging industries is aquaculture that the DDGs is really kind of looking into, or it has a nice fit with some of the diets. So this is a very recent article looking at lipid extracted DDGs in Pacific white shrimp. So the objective of this whole study was to evaluate the growth response of Pacific white shrimp when fed reduced fat DDGs. So what did they find, or I should say, how was the study designed? They fed 5 diets, and it was increasing reduced fat DDGs, so 0, 10, 20, 30, and 40. And then they also fed a 40% reduced fat DDG with supplemental lysine, just to evaluate if there was a lysine deficiency once we got up to that amount. As they increased the DDGs, soybean meal decreased proportionally. So the results, if we look at the final biomass and then the final mean weight, really the best performance was observed in the shrimp fed the 10% reduced fat DDGs. No significant differences were observed in any of the treatments, and including the lysine supplemented diet. So bottom line from that is that DDGs can be an effective source of protein in these aquaculture diets, especially as we look at concerns regarding the availability of fish meal or other ingredients typical for the aquaculture diets. But basically, can't see my last slide here, but just a summary of the presentation. Look at the reduced fat DDGs can be a very, very effective source of DDGs. It's very, very similar to commodity DDGs. The bottom line, I guess, the one thing that I would like to leave you with is to make sure that you realize that the fat content is not the only indicator of quality. There are a lot of other measures, and part of our objective, and I think part of the challenge in the industry for reduced fat or low fat DDGs, is really getting a better characterization of that reduced fat and the eventual impacts on the animal. So that kind of concludes my presentation. If you have any questions, I'd be glad to entertain them now, or or later.
Thanks, Kevin. Whoops. I've got one of our attendees from the Philippines typed in a question. Can you see it on your screen or not?
Uh, no, I can't.
It's because I've got the PowerPoint slides up, I think. Anyway, Adi Morales from the Philippines had a question early in the presentation about why the reduction in DDGs fat, why the de-oiled DDGs reduced amino acid digestibility. And I thought you touched on that fairly well later on in the presentation. Adi, was that the answer you were looking for, or do you need more?
Seems to be fine, yes. But on one of the slides, it was indicated there's an improvement in fiber digestibility. How would that be possible?
That data was actually from some beef data that's been done in Minnesota and also Nebraska. And their hypothesis is that with the lower fat DDGs in the diet, it doesn't either, number one, it doesn't coat the fiber in the rumen. So then there's actually, more availability to the rumen microbes to digest that fiber. Or else, number two, that the less fat in the DDG wouldn't affect the rumen microbe population as much. So if there isn't as much impact on the rumen microbes, there's more bacteria to actually digest the fiber and actually go through with that. So those are the two hypotheses about why that occurred, or why that condition occurs.
So the improvement in fiber digestibility on reduced oil DDGs would only be applicable to ruminants? From
that hypothesis, if we look at some of the other factors with fiber digestibility, that probably relates more to some of the processes in the ethanol process. So especially if we have conditions where there's a lot of heat and we have, say, that Maillard reaction that's tying up some of the protein with the carbohydrates, that would probably affect a little bit more. But that certain study that I was referencing there, yes, that would just be related to the ruminant market.
Okay, thanks.
For poultry, I think there is a reduction on energy value with lower fat, probably more pronounced than pig. Is this correct?
I guess yes and no. It depends on kind of the reduction, what you're comparing it to. I guess, is it another commodity DDG, and then also a lot on the process that we go through. So if we have a DDG with, say, a little bit lower fat, but considerably lower fiber or better digestibility fiber than, say, a commodity DDG with a higher fat, then that energy value is probably very similar. If the fiber portion or the fiber component and the fiber digestibility is very, very similar between the two DDGs, and it was just the fat that's being lowered, then yes, there probably would be a little bit lower energy value. So it's really very difficult to, I guess, to really kind of characterize some of the energy values with the lower fat DDGs, and really have to be consider more factors than just the fat.
There's another question here. I understand that yeast is added during the fermentation process in ethanol plants. You mentioned that yeast can be a good protein sources. My question is, what amount of yeast is usually added during the fermentation process?
Ooh, that's a good question. Really, it kind of depends a lot on the different method, or the different plants and the ethanol systems that they use. Really, I guess it's the whole premise for the yeast really is to get as much ethanol extraction from the corn as possible. So that's what they're going to kind of focus it on, rather than the DDGs. My comment was kind of the yeast growth and actually how that contributes to the DDGs, and especially the biomass. I do have a couple individuals here from Poet. Do you have any comments on that, or do you have any thoughts on how much on that question?
I mean, I think it varies by each plant. Yeah, and the yeast that's put in. I mean, for the most part, it's really got a lot to do with the corn quality in each region. Probably more so is the variability, because corn quality around each plant is different, just based on the growing conditions. So, I mean, I wouldn't say the protein from yeast is insignificant, but the biggest variable is probably more from the corn than it is the yeast.
And that's a good point because even if it is, it's only 20% of the DDG protein is from the yeast, but it's still an advantage as far as from the quality of the protein, the quality of the amino acids.
Good morning. This is Ryan LeGrand. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Yep.
Yeah. Hi. I'm down here in the Mexico office. You know, marketing two different types of DDGs has always been a challenge. I saw it when I was selling DDGs, when I would sell from most of the open market, and then I would sell Poet DDGs as well. So this information is very helpful, and I appreciate it. But my question is, you know, we've seen most of the industry, or a good part of the industry, start spinning off certain amounts of oil, but nobody has done it to the extent that Poet's doing it. Why hasn't the rest of the industry followed suit and brought their distillers down to 4.5% fat? And if not, are they going that way eventually?
I'll weigh in on that, and then I'll also ask my colleagues here to weigh in on it as well. I would say yes, the industry probably is headed that way, just from the economics of the market for corn oil and DDGs. I guess one of the big reasons is maybe that they haven't designated as much resources towards that technology, because it is difficult to get it down, and Poet was able to develop that technology where we can get it down that much. I think as more and more resources are devoted towards that, you'll see additional ethanol plants really work towards that goal. Would you agree, Isaac and Mike?
Yeah, so it's a good question. You know, when the oil extraction, I don't know, processes started with each of the plants, they took out as much oil as they can, and there's been new advancements on extraction aids. So one of the differences with Poet and I guess the rest of the industry is our process is a little bit different. So we don't cook our corn on the front, so we were able to extract more of the oil because it was more available. It wasn't bound up, so it wasn't you know, completely on purpose. We were going to do more oil, but our process allowed us to extract more oil, which is why we were able to get more early on. And you know, I think early on we had 45 cent oil, soybean oil at least, and so I mean that was a good driver to continue to pull out as much as possible. Now what we've seen in the last year, I mean I think just last week, one of our close competitors moved their tag from 6 to 5. So I mean, as long as oil is worth more than distillers, I think we'll continue to see more and more plants take out as much oil as they can, just as especially as margins continue to get squeezed, and you know, alternative sources of revenue are looked for on co-products.
Okay, thanks, Isaac. It's good to hear from you.
Yeah, you too, Ryan.
So what can we do? What can, as a, you know, I'm just speaking for the team that I'm a part of here in Mexico. I know you have the Laguna region pretty well locked down with Lala. What can we do in other parts of Mexico to help you guys promote your distillers?
Well,
or is that a question for a different call?
I mean, it might be, but I can answer it on this one. I mean, for us, you know, we're looking to try and expand it in all of our international markets, but Mexico's probably one of the easier opportunities based on logistics. But really, for the consumer, it's really about knowing your supplier. You know, the biggest complaint about distillers is inconsistency. You know, so whether you're buying from Poet, and we have like product across all of our plants, so you probably have a little bit more supply assurance. But regardless of who you're buying from, if you jump around from plant to plant, your inconsistencies in product is going to jump around pretty high.
Yep.
And so for us, that's one of our benefits. So, we've sold to customers who bought DDGs 5, 6, 7 years ago, would never buy it again. And we sold them on our program, and they continue to buy, month after month. And they won't look at other sources because of the inconsistencies of it. So I guess for the feed millers, they really need to understand where it's coming from versus just treating it as a commodity. And the reason for that is when you put in your energy equations and your nutrient equations, if you're getting a high variability product, you're going to not give it the full value that it probably deserves. So understanding the source, you can save more in your ration by putting the full value in distillers, and you'll feed more distillers when the price competitive for how a ration should look at that point in time.
Okay. Thank you.
I
Okay, thank
actually
you.
have 2 more questions.
Yep. Thank you, Betsy.
The first one is any comments on color? We have heard from some end users that sometime they received dark color DDGs in 2015, which seldom happened in the previous years.
There is a lot of discussion on the color, especially in the export market more than domestic market. Some of the big reasons for the differences in color are if we have a little bit more residual glucose, which is a bad thing from the ethanol because we really want to extract or use most of the glucose. There could be some heating or some burning, especially if it gets too hot and we get that color DDGs. But probably one of the bigger factors is the amount of solubles that are actually added back to the DDGs, or once it goes through the dryer. So once again, kind of going back to the variability statement that Isaac just made, that probably has a lot more to do with it. So just color alone probably is a very poor indicator of quality. It could be one of those other factors that are really affecting what color you're seeing in the DDGs.
All right. I also have a question from Neil in Canada. We are seeing an increasing movement to antibiotic-free diets. We now have chicken, turkey, swine, and feedlot producers excluding DDGs because DDGs are produced using antibiotics. I assume similar trends in the USA. Are ethanol plants able to be antibiotic-free? How may that evolve in your operation? Thank you.
Yes, antibiotic or ethanol plants are able to be antibiotic-free, but there is the cost with the ethanol. Sometimes, just keeping those fermenters a little bit cleaner. That's the whole reason. Kind of goes back to the protocols of each plant and how precise they are with their ability to minimize that. It would be nice to eliminate it completely, but like I mentioned with the efficiency right now, still be able to use in DDGs right now, virginomycin or penicillin, but at very, very, very low levels because we try to minimize obviously the cost of those antibiotics. So, but yeah, it's a trend that we're looking at and that we're kind of hoping to come up with alternative solutions.
I have one more question. As a nutritionist, reduced oil DDGs will negatively affect the energy content, especially metabolizable energy and net energy content of DDGs in swine and poultry. So it would be good to have more research data on how reduced fat contents of DDGs will affect on ME or NE contents in swine, layer, and broiler diets. These kinds of information will help our feed formulators to use more DDGs with confidence. And this is from, I'm hoping I'm saying his name correctly, Subu Shim in Korea.
Oh, yep, and you make a very good point, and that's kind of what we're really focusing our research efforts to characterize reduced fat DDGs a little bit better, so we can have really accurate estimates of energy, and especially how it relates to different species.